Okay, hello. My name is James Porteus, and I'm here today to talk about the shorebirds at the Long Nanny. So just before I do that, I thought I'd introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my background. So I work as a ranger for the National Trust. I've been working for the National Trust in Northumberland for the last 3 years or so. I started off in 2018 working as a seasonal warden at the Long Nanny. Which was just an amazing way to get into working in conservation in Northumberland. It's a fantastic place, as hopefully you'll appreciate by the end of this presentation. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. I went on from there to work on the Farne Islands, and I spent a season working on the Farne Islands in 2019. So from April through to December, I was working there. And off the back of that, I was very fortunate to get the position that I have now as a ranger on the Northumberland coast. So this role involves looking after around 13 miles of coastline spread out between Beadnell Bay in the south and Lindisfarne in the north. And that encompasses the Long Nanny, and part of my role is to manage the Long Nanny shorebird sites during the summer months. So managing the seasonal wardens and the volunteers there. And I must say it is one of the highlights of the job. It's a brilliant site to be involved in. We also have 2 inland sites, one at Ross Castle and another at St Cuthbert's Cave. So we're quite a varied property, quite spread out, and it's a fantastic place to work. So that's a bit about me. So let's talk about the Long Nanny. I mean, I presume that many people watching this will have visited, but you may well not have. For anybody who doesn't know where the Long Nanny is, it's in that red square. So it's on the coast in North Northumberland, not far from Sea Houses. That's the sort of nearest sizable town. It's halfway between the villages of Beadnell and Newton by the Sea, so it's right in the middle of Beadnell Bay. I mean, Beadnell especially is very popular now with holiday makers in the summer months especially. So Beadnell Bay is a very busy beach. We get a lot of visitor traffic. Certainly one of the pressures on the shorebird sites, but wonderful part of the coast, very picturesque, and really, really beautiful place. So that's a slightly more zoomed in map of the site, just to give you a better idea of the geography of the area. So you can see the site is situated at the confluence of 2 burns. So you have the Brunton burn coming up from the south, and the Long Nanny burn, hence the name, Long Nanny burn coming down from the north, and they join together and they flow out to sea. You can see they sweep very sharply at the big meander to the north here as the burn skirts around the edge of what we call the sand spit. So hopefully you can make out here the high tide mark. So you can see the lighter area of sand. That sand is raised, and that area only gets covered over by the tide in very high spring tides, so only sort of once a month at most. So that's a really important feature of the site, that raised area of sand. There's also a large area of salt marsh here, just to the east of the Long Nanny Bridge, which is another important feature, and it's particularly important for wading birds during the winter months. And the site generally is extremely important. It's covered by numerous nature conservation designations. It's part of the Northumberland Dunes Special Area of Conservation. It's a triple SI and an SPA as well. So a hugely important place for nature all year round. But I think especially during the summer months when it's home to thousands of breeding terns and breeding ringed plover as well. So have a look at the different species of bird which breed at the Long Nanny. I'll start off looking at the little tern here in the top left corner. So arguably the most important species of bird which breeds at the Long Nanny. If you've not seen little terns before, they're fantastic birds. They're the smallest tern which breeds in Britain. They really are. They really are little, as the name suggests. Little terns have been breeding at the Long Nanny since the 1950s. There was only a handful of pairs back then, only a couple of pairs breeding in the 50s. These days, we would typically expect between 30 and 40 pairs to nest annually at the Long Nanny. So that's up to about 2% of the British population. Little terns, they're amber listed. There's about 1,900 pairs left breeding in Britain. So they're actually the second rarest seabird in this country after the roseate tern. So, really important that we focus our conservation efforts on protecting this species. The Long Nanny, 2% nationally, it's an important site nationally, but also locally in the northeast, it's one of only a handful of sites that supports breeding little terns. There's the Wide Opens up on Lindisfarne National Nature Reserve, which typically hosts good numbers of birds, and then there's a couple of sites down in Teesside near Hartlepool, Crimdon Dean and Seaton Carew down on the coast in Teesside, which also host little terns. But it is certainly a very important site, the Long Nanny, and it's very important that we keep these places that little terns can breed, these small oases, if you like. So the next slide is a graph, and this shows the annual number of breeding pairs and fledglings of little terns at the Long Nanny between 1980 and 2021. As I say, little terns have actually bred at the Long Nanny since the 50s. The National Trust didn't start managing the site until 1977. So I could only find data going back to 1980. But I think that gives us 40 years worth of data, which is plenty to be going along with. So the blue line indicates the number of breeding pairs. As you can see, in 1980, there was only a handful of pairs. And then sort of by the late 80s, it rose quite sharply. And, by 1994, you can see that's the maximum number of pairs that we've ever had. So that was 57 pairs in 1994 bred at the site. So that's the most we've ever had. The orange line shows the number of fledglings, and you can see the orange line typically is quite far below the blue line. So just because you have 57 pairs of breeding little terns, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get 57 or more fledglings away. Unfortunately, the productivity isn't always the best, and that's indicated quite clearly on this graph. There are a few exceptions. So sort of noticeably in the early 90s there, and again 2014, but 2019 here, really recently, only 2 years ago, was a fantastic year when we had 34 pairs of little terns fledging, 54 chicks. So that was a record year in terms of productivity, and really positive to get such good figures so recently. You will notice the steep drop off at the end here. So in 2021, we recorded no breeding pairs, which is accurate. But I also I also feel it's slightly misleading because it implies that there were no birds at all at the Long Nanny season just gone, which isn't true. There were little terns at the site in reasonably good numbers. They were observed sort of doing courtship displays and scraping and mating. There were birds sat on scrapes, except we never actually found any evidence that they had laid, which is why we had to record a 0 for the number of breeding pairs. So I suppose a couple of takeaways from this graph would be that the number of breeding pairs does fluctuate year to year. Obviously, to have no breeding pairs this year is a real shame, but it does fluctuate, and the fact that there were good numbers of birds around this season, I think, is still a positive, and I'm hopeful that next year there will be a reasonable number of pairs return and breed successfully. The other takeaway as well, which I've already mentioned, is that just because you have a high number of pairs breeding doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a good number of fledglings. So trying to increase productivity is something which would be great, and something that we could try and work on. Isn't necessarily easy, but it's quite clear to see here that the productivity isn't always the highest at this site. So the next species to talk about is the Arctic tern, top right corner, also known as a sea swallow, a really elegant bird. Northumberland is almost famed for the Arctic tern. I think if you've ever been on a trip to the Farne Islands, you will have experienced these birds at close quarters. I must say the Long Nanny is, well, possibly, it depends on your viewpoint, possibly better for viewing Arctic terns, because you can get sort of just as close to them if you go up to the viewing platform at the Tern Hut at the Long Nanny. And the sort of the plus side of viewing them at the Long Nanny versus the Farne Islands is that you shouldn't, or most people don't, get their heads pecked, which, you know, it depends on your persuasion. Some people, I think, quite like the experience of being pecked, but it is a fantastic place to view these birds, the Long Nanny. And we typically, in recent years, have been getting really good numbers of birds breeding at the site. So Arctic terns didn't actually start breeding at the Long Nanny until 1980. So when the little terns were at the Long Nanny in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Arctic terns weren't there. After the National Trust started to manage the site and roped the area off, provide a disturbance-free area, the Arctic terns moved in, and since then they've done exceptionally well. So these birds are also amber listed. So again, you know, really important that we focus our efforts on conserving these birds. I'm just going to show you the same graphic, except this shows the breeding figures for Arctic terns between 1980 and 2021 at the Long Nanny, with the red line showing the number of breeding pairs, the green line the number of fledglings. So you can see how through the 80s, actually the number of breeding pairs was quite low as they started to establish, but from the early 90s, the number of pairs really took off. And in the last decade, we've seen really high numbers of birds breeding at the site. So, for example, in 2014, there was over 2,400 pairs, and 2018, which was when I first worked at the site, there was a record year, and there was 2,892 pairs of Arctic terns breeding at the Long Nanny, which actually made the Long Nanny the largest mainland colony of breeding Arctic terns in the UK. So hugely nationally important site for this species. Again, similarly to the little tern graph, though, you can see that the population size does fluctuate from year to year. You know, quite steeply, actually. I mean, between 2014 and 2018, those two really high years, it dropped off quite sharply there. So that's something sort of, I think, to always bear in mind, that just because you have a poor year doesn't mean that the following year or a couple of years later we're not going to see an increase again. And the number of fledglings, again, there have been some poor years for fledglings where the productivity has been exceptionally low. Similarly, there's been some exceptionally good years as well, and again, it just fluctuates, and I think it largely is down to the sort of the contributing factors and how they each year, that we'll go through later, the predators, the disturbance, the sort of severity of those can vary year on year. Partly, I think it is partly down to luck, I suppose. The final species, which I think is often overlooked and shouldn't be, is the ringed plover. So there it is at the bottom of the screen. So the ringed plover is red listed. So really important that we do all we can to try and protect these birds. They do seem to be doing quite well now in Northumberland. There are conservation efforts from other organisations as well to try and create sort of disturbance-free zones to aid the breeding success of these birds. The Long Nanny is has the potential to be a really good refuge with such a large area roped off. Typically, well, I'll go to the next slide. So I don't have the data going back quite so far. The ringed plover, we're currently working our way through our historic data. So this graph only goes back to 2013. The yellow line is the number of breeding pairs. So you can see in 2014 you had 18 breeding pairs, which is a really good number. More recently, it's been somewhere between sort of 5 and 10 breeding pairs. And I think there probably is potential for more than that. And hopefully in the coming years, we will see more again. But it's a similar pattern, really. This is just almost a snapshot. But you can see again the population size and number of fledglings fluctuating again year to year. So they're the species that breed at the Long Nanny. 3 hugely important species of birds, amazing birds with great stories. So what are the threats that are faced by these birds at the Long Nanny colony? These threats aren't necessarily specific to the Long Nanny. Some of them are, but a lot of these will be issues that are faced across many of the different breeding sites in the country. I'm just going to go through a few here. So the first one, predators. So the Long Nanny being a mainland colony, we get a huge variety of predators. So unlike places such as the Farne Islands or other islands where main issues are avian predators such as gulls, we also get things such as stoats, foxes, rats. Even sometimes we have badgers, otters on the site, which are all capable of taking chicks and eggs. So I mean, I've listed, I've got photographs of someone here, the kestrel, black-headed gull, crow. Others might include barn owl. We've witnessed barn owl predation in the past. Grey heron, peregrine falcon. So there's a huge number of animals which you can get on site, which potentially cause a threat. And it's not just the issue of a predator coming in and stealing a chick or an egg out of the nest. Obviously, that's ultimately what we're trying to avoid. But just that the presence of these animals around the site can unsettle the birds and can stress them. And that also is a problem. In recent seasons, we've witnessed that overnight, adult birds will leave the nest after they've laid. So they'll have laid a full clutch, and at night when temperatures dipping to single figures, the adult birds are deserting the nests, and we think that's because of the presence of predators, particularly ground predators such as stoats, and it's causing the adults to become stressed, and they're worried for their own safety, worried about being predated themselves, so they leave the nests overnight. So tern egg embryos are supposedly temperate terns. The embryos are capable of withstanding quite low temperatures, probably lower than you'd expect, so they can withstand temperatures in single figures for for hours at a time. But it's not just the problem of chilling. Then those eggs are vulnerable to predation themselves. And of course, if the adults are away for too long and temperatures do drop, sometimes in May or in early June they can drop as low as sort of 6 or 7, and that is really quite cold. And the eggs might not survive in those temperatures. So predation is a particularly challenging aspect of managing the long nanny, trying to guess which predator is going to be the worst offender each year is a difficult task, almost impossible, and it does vary. So, for example, in 2021, the season just gone, we had particularly bad experiences with crows and stoats. I mean, both of those are really ferocious predators, and they can come in and crows can come in and be taking tens, if not hundreds, of eggs, probably over the course of a day. And similarly for stoats, they're taking large numbers of eggs each day in chicks. But then if you go back to when I was a ranger at the Long Nanny as a seasonal warden in 2018, actually crows and stoats, we didn't really have much of a problem. The main problems were black-headed gulls and kestrels, and it does just vary from year to year. So it is difficult to plan and to keep on top of these things. So the next one is disturbance. So disturbance is certainly not unique to the Long Nanny. This is a problem which is, I suppose, being highlighted more up and down the coast. I mean, the Long Nanny specifically, though, as I alluded to earlier, is situated in a really popular place. Beadnell is beautiful, attracts a lot of holiday makers, and in the summer you get huge numbers of walkers, dog walkers, kayakers, surfers, all sorts of people coming to use the beach. And a lot of these people don't know that there is a nationally significant breeding birds colony there. And inevitably, when people come into contact with birds, it can cause disturbance events. So I put a breakdown here of the human disturbance incidents recorded last year. Just to say, before we go into this, there were only 70 incidents of human disturbance recorded last season, which is relatively low, and I think that's testament to the work done by our rangers and volunteers who spend a lot of time engaging with people on the beach and taking preventative action to try and stop people from getting too close or asking people to put their dogs on the lead. But you can see here, maybe surprisingly, the biggest contributor to human disturbance was actually this light grey segment, which is small aircraft / microlights. So that's something we see a lot of actually on the coast is microlights, and they seem to be becoming more and more popular. And I suppose it's unsurprising, this huge silhouetted figure, a loud rumbling noise flying quite low. Birds may mistake it for it's sort of an unknown flying object, maybe a large avian predator. So it's unsurprising that these microlights cause mass disturbance events, and they can send the whole colony up. And that is obviously much more difficult for us to police. We can't go and speak to the pilot of this microlight as we might be able to go and speak to a walker on the beach. So I think there's an issue around trying to engage with the airfields and trying to make the issue more transparent and getting the message across before people take to the air. So other ones that you might expect, 16% here, which is dog off the lead. I think the thing with dog off the lead, the thing with dogs off the lead is they don't need to be quite so close to the colony to cause a disturbance. So I would say a walker, maybe 10, 20 meters away might not cause a disturbance, whereas dog off the lead, 10, 20 meters away from the ropes might, which maybe is why that figure is so high. Also, of course, there are just a lot of dogs now. Is another possible reason that that figure is high. So I just thought that would be quite interesting to see different types. So in case you can't read this, I'll just run through. So we've got walkers, dogs on and off the lead, joggers, bird watchers and photographers. It's relatively small portion, but it does account for 5% of the human disturbance. So I think photographers and bird watchers, they often think that that they're not causing a problem, because they typically they know about the birds that they're looking at, but we do have problems with people trying to get too close, trying to get the perfect photograph, or trying to get a really good view of whatever bird it is that they're trying to see. So that's certainly one to look out for as well. We've got fishermen on there, horse riders, the aircraft and microlights, and other aircraft as well. So spring tides is the next one. This again, not exclusively only a problem at the Long Nanny, but it is, I would say, it is one of the problems which maybe would be more associated with the Long Nanny compared to other sites, and is a particularly, we do suffer significant losses from spring tides most seasons. So the spring tides affect all three species, but generally it's the little terns which are worst affected by the spring tides. So as an example, generally tides below 4.8, 4.9 meters won't cause significant disruption in tidal inundation. Any tides, I'd say, above 4.9 meters have the potential to flood large areas of the sand spit, which is where the terns nest. So if I just click on here, this image is taken from Google Maps, another aerial photograph. So you can see the sand spit here. You can see as well these dark blobs, vaguely make them out. If you zoom in on Google Maps closer, they become a little clearer. These will have been little tern nests which are raised up. So this gives you an idea of where the little terns, where they nest. Arctic terns typically will nest around the base of the dune, some of them actually in the dunes themselves, in these areas of bare sand. And we do actually strim as well, strim an area of the dune, which attracts quite a lot of birds into this, we call it the tern garden, into the tern garden to breed. And obviously these birds are not at any risk of being inundated by the tide. Ringed plover, a little bit more random in terms of where they breed. They can breed anywhere from the dune edge right out onto the sand spit. But you can see, because of the cluster and the location of these little tern nests, they don't nest in the same place every year, but I would say normally they are much further out, and that's not that's not unusual for them to be out that far. They're much more at risk. A tide over 4.9 meters would certainly cover that area where the little terns are. And for example, last year at the end of May, there were 5 tides which exceeded 4.9 meters, and at the end of June there were 6 tides which exceeded 4.9 meters. So there are plenty of tides which during the breeding season which have the potential to flood nests, and also the severity of these tides can be heightened, if you like, by the weather. So, for example, if you've got strong onshore winds, that can push the tide in further. If you have a really large swell, that will also push the tide in further, and low pressure as well can cause the tide to rise higher. And often the worst impacts of tidal inundation are when these things coincide, when you get a big spring tide coinciding with a rainy, miserable, windy, swelly day. We can suffer really significant losses. And So, for example, in 2020, there were 38 little terns pairs, which laid in May. These nests weren't raised onto nest boxes, and in June, at the beginning of June, we had some very high spring tides, and all 38 nests were lost to tidal inundation. They were all flooded, and unfortunately, then at the end of June, birds did relay, but only 13 pairs relayed. So we lost a significant portion of nests and of pairs to tidal inundation in 2020, and it does show what a problem it is. And of course, it affects the other species as well, but nowhere near as much as it does the little terns. So the final one is, I've got on here, is increased extreme weather events during the breeding season. So climate change, essentially. Some nice photographs on there. It's a nice big wave. This is taken just off Football Hole, if you know that. So that's just south of Beadnell Bay. But big, as I already said, big swells like that, strong winds coinciding with the spring tide in the summer can have devastating consequences. But it's not just when they coincide with spring tides. Rough seas during the breeding season can make it more difficult for the birds to find food. We've got a picture here of sort of sand blowing on beaches. So in windy weather, you can get mini sandstorms, and I've seen eggs and chicks being buried by sand. And especially as I mentioned earlier, when adults are leaving the nest overnight, if they're sort of stressed and worried about predation, when the eggs are left in the scrape unattended, there's real potential for the eggs to be buried by sand in windy weather, and also in cold weather as well, for them to chill. And I've got down here the sun. I think people often think that good spells of warm weather is really important, and it is important to have mild weather, but supposedly we're going to experience more intense heat waves, more common heat waves, more frequent heat waves over the coming years. We've already had some quite hot summers, and certainly overheating of chicks and eggs is going to be a possibility in the coming years as well. And something which isn't necessarily mentioned on here is also what's happening not during the breeding season, but during the winter, spring and autumn on migration routes and wintering grounds. So, storms during migration over winter in Africa or Antarctica, wherever these birds go, that's going to affect how many birds we have returning to breed at the Long Nanny, and also the food availability on migration routes and overwintering destinations as well is going to have an impact on the populations at the Long Nanny. And one final thing, I don't have a slide for this, but so in 2019 we lost a huge number of Arctic terns. About a third of the breeding population were found dead. Suspected avian botulism, the cause, and an event like this, which kills huge numbers of birds, had a huge effect on the colony. I think we've been seeing the knock-on effects from that over the last couple of years, with fewer birds than we would normally expect returning to breed. And of course, it would be great if this was a sort of isolated one-off event, but it is possible that these sort of mass death events could happen again in the future, and that obviously is a factor which will have serious consequences as well. So, what does the National Trust do at Long Nanny? What do we do to try and help these birds and to try and get the highest breeding success that we possibly can? I have alluded to quite a lot of this already. The first thing to say is we erect fencing every year and close the site off, try and minimise the impact of human disturbance as much as possible. there's two different lines on here. There's a red line and a blue dotted line. The red line indicates fencing which is up all year round. That is predator fencing, which goes around the perimeter of the site in the dunes. It's 2 layers of chicken wire overlaid, so the gauge is so narrow that small mammals, for example, stoats and weasels, shouldn't be able to fit through theoretically. Badgers, otters, foxes, also, it's a barrier to them. Obviously, some will be able to jump it, but a barrier is still better than nothing. It's dug into the ground, it's dug into the turf, so that animals shouldn't be able to bury underneath it, and it's curved over at the top. So if a stoat or a weasel were to try and climb up the outside of the fence, they would reach an overhang and theoretically fall off and not be able to climb over. So that's up year round, and then in May we go down with our staff and volunteers and put up seasonal fencing, which is up from May through to July, sometimes into August, and that's indicated by the blue dotted line. So that's what we put up this year. So from the southern boundary right up to the dunes on the north side of the burn, we put a rope fence all the way along the beach. So we have Arctic terns breeding right along the beach, right along to the southern boundary here, utilising the full extent of the roped off area. This is, at the moment, we just use a single rope which is suspended from wooden posts along that stretch. It's a long way, it's almost a kilometre that distance. We also roped off this blue dotted line, which was a walkway. So it's an extremely popular walk for people who live in Beadnell, people coming on holiday, to walk along the beach from the village south towards the Long Nanny, and then they walk along the dune edge up to the Long Nanny Bridge. Some people continue south towards Low Newton, and others loop back through the dunes back towards Beadnell. This year we decided that we would allow access along the north side, and we roped off a walkway. It was about 2 meters wide, so we could control access. People weren't running, having their dogs running all over the beach, north side of the burn. It was, people had to keep their dogs on a short lead, had to stay within the roped area and keep moving as much as possible and not linger. And I'd say that it worked reasonably well this year. One thing just to say as well about the rope fencing here on the beach. So we put the rope fencing in as far down the beach as we possibly can, so as far down towards the sea as possible. And you always find that wherever you put the rope fence is where people walk to, so people will come as close as they can until there's a fence there telling them not to. And most people stop. Some people do walk underneath the roping, but most people stop. I mean, ideally, we would put the rope fence much further down the beach to give the birds as much as a buffer zone as possible, to keep as much distance as possible between people and the breeding site. But logistically, that's just not really possible, because the wooden posts which support the fence wash out at high tide. And that's something which I think is quite difficult for us to get across to people, is that we would like to have the fencing further down the beach, but we can't. So actually, when the tide's out, please don't approach the fence. Please still stay well back from the fence. And that's something I think that we need to look at in future, and possibly having a ranger walking permanently down on the beach here, engaging with people and asking them to stay back, is something which we can consider for future years. So rangers and volunteers, obviously, I've mentioned this already, we have both rangers and volunteers working at the site. So there's between 5 and 6 paid seasonal wardens, which spend 24 hours a day camping on site between May and July, photograph their tents. It's quite an amazing experience, and you know, it's like an immersive job, and a really really sort of rewarding job as well, I think. And everybody that does it seems to enjoy themselves. Um, so they camp out and they do all sorts of responsibilities. So they will monitor the birds. So that is that they do roost counts, they do clutch counts, they monitor for predators, they do feeding surveys. They'll work through the night on shifts as well. So they have a thermal imaging camera. They'll keep watch for predators, and the thermal imaging camera makes it easier to see animals at night. For example, stoats or weasels, which will easily go undetected, can be seen with this, and obviously the larger things like badgers and foxes. And as well, they do a really great job of engaging with members of the public, asking them to put their dogs on leads, asking them to keep back when taking photographs, and just explaining about the work that we do, and explaining about the stories of the birds, and trying to inspire people really, and trying to empower people to make them want to make a difference, and make people want to help support us and want to protect the birds. And the volunteers do a very similar job to that in terms of engagement. They play a really important role. The site's so big that it would be so very, very difficult for one person or a couple of rangers to engage with everybody at once. So we need volunteers to help us with that, and they do a really great job in that regard. Nest raising. So I've talked about the impacts of spring tides, and what we do to try and mitigate that effect is raise nests onto fish boxes. So there's some photographs there of what we do. So the process is that when you have a spring tide forecast, you sort of identify the nests which are most at risk, and the nests that you think will be impacted by the tide. And what we do is throughout the year, we'll go down, even when it's not the breeding season, and we can see where the tide's coming to, get an idea of what the sand level on the spit is like in a given year, and how high we'll expect the tide to come. We don't want to raise nests if we don't have to, because if you move the nest, it can confuse, disorientate the parents, and lead to abandonment. So we only do it if we really think that that nest is going to be flooded. And the process is that you get a fish crate, you fill it with sand, and you place the fish crate slightly inland of where the nest is, so that it's that little bit further away from the sea, and you recreate the scrape on the box. So you use your fist to make a small indentation in the sand, and you're moving all of the debris, so small shell fragments, bits of seaweed, pebbles, keeping the orientation and lifting them onto the box and recreating it as accurately as possible, and then moving the eggs, again preserving the orientation. And generally the take back rate is quite good. So for example, in 2019, I think during one of the spring tides, we raised 34 nests, and take back rate was 86%. So 86% of adults came back to brood afterwards, 14% abandoned. So that kind of figure, I'd say, is pretty normal, which is why we only do it if we feel that we have to. What we can do then, if we have time, is then put the fish box onto a wooden pallet. And we don't do that all at the same time. We'll do that a few days afterwards. What we try to avoid we're limited. We can't spend too long doing nest raising at any one time, because we are only licensed to be in there and disturbing the terns 20 minutes at a time. We have to limit the time that we're disturbing the terns for. And also, I think that if we were to put the nest onto a pallet, onto a fish box all in one go, it could be too much, and that abandonment rate could be higher, which is why we try and stagger it. So that's something that we do at the site, which I think does make a really positive difference. If most of these nests, although the abandonment rate was 14%, if we hadn't raised them, we would have lost probably all of them, like we did in 2020, where 38 nests were lost to flooding. So that gives you an idea of the things that we do at the site, and gives you an idea of the challenges that are faced at the Long Nanny. So in terms of what's next, well, I think there's a couple of things that we can maybe do. Certainly looking at the fencing along the beach, I wonder if there's scope to maybe try and improve that. I mean, I would love to be able to move it further down the beach, but I'm not sure how possible that is. But as I said, at the moment, we only use one strand of rope, and I think looking at other options for fencing, if we can get kind of like sheep netting, that would be brilliant. Something like that, which is going to stop animals and dogs from running through. That can make a real positive difference. Also trying to improve our messaging. I'm not saying that our messaging is bad, but I think there's always, it's always sensible to look at what you're saying and just to see where you can improve that. And I think it's important to recognise that Beadnell is such a popular destination, and it's getting busier and busier, and probably that's not going to change. I would imagine that it will continue to get busier. And trying to really focus on our engagement and getting that message out to people. Hopefully what we'd like to do is make it so that people know about the site before they arrive there, because at the moment most people just happen across the sites. They don't know that there's thousands of terns breeding on the beach, and they're completely blown away by the site, and they're really inspired. But they don't necessarily, that might be just after they've accidentally got too close and disturbed the birds, or whatever. So I think trying to get that message across earlier, and that could be through engaging with local businesses or guest houses. If those people can get the message across, that'd be fantastic. And certainly looking at our signage and where we put our signage, and maybe we can get signage in car parks and villages. That would be a real step forwards. So working with stakeholders and partners is going to be really, really important, and getting the local community more involved would be fantastic. To give them a real sense of sort of pride and ownership in the site, which I think probably many of them have already. But just trying to get that message across and get people involved wherever possible. And I think the final thing just to consider as well is climate change. That's going to be a really important consideration over the coming years and decades. Probably in 10, 20 years, the Long Nanny site is going to look quite different to how it looks today. I mean, already it's very dynamic, and it changes. The course of the burn changes year on year. The sand levels on the sand spit sort of fluctuate from year to year. But as I say, over a longer time period, I think those changes could be quite dramatic. So I think trying to consider ways to create more space for these birds, create new areas where they might be able to breed is going to be really important. And just keeping an open mind and being ready to adapt and being able to adapt as well is going to be really important. So I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.